evening, everyone, and I am Miss Maria F. Aguilon, and I will be the one to report the first part of Confessional Poetry. So I hope you will listen and will learn some valuable lesson from our discussion. So how are you today? And to answer that question, kindly drop the emoji that represents your feelings or emotions this morning in our in-call messages, which will also serve as our attendance. So make sure to drop the emojis in our chat box. And in order for me to know if you are really listening attentively throughout my presentation, I would ask some questions related to my topic in between my discussion. Okay, so listen and answer because it will be recorded as well. And to formally start our discussion, I would like to first present the lesson objectives. Okay, so the confessional poetry began as one of many artistic movements in post-war 20th century America. And when we say post-war 20th century America, it is also called as Cold War era. So Cold War era is where the soldiers of the Soviet Union and the United States did not battle directly during the Cold War, but the two superpowers continually to antagonize each other through political maneuvering, military coalitions, espionage, propaganda, armed build-ups, economic aid, and proxy wars between other nations. And for our question number 1, okay, listen. Post-war 20th century America is also called as A. Bloody War era, B. Fire War era, C. Cold War era, or D. Death War era. So, type your answers in the comment box in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So, okay, back on track. So, Cold War era explains why confessional poetry's most fundamental aspect is blatant autobiographical content, which often manifests as self-deprecation. And when we say autobiographical content, it is a self-written life story or the story of the author. Remember that, okay? However, confessional poetry involves self-deprecation, which is the act of reprimanding oneself by belittling, undervaluing, disparaging oneself, or being excessively modest. Okay, and for our question number 2, listen. It is the act of reprimanding oneself by belittling, undervaluing, disparaging oneself, or being excessively modest. So letter A, self-depression. Letter B, self-deprecation. Letter C, self-blaming, or letter D, self-hating. So type your answers in the comment box in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. So okay, back on track. Why is that? Let us look for more interesting facts. Confessional poetry has been described as the poetry of the personal or I, focusing on extreme moments of individual experience, the psyche, and personal trauma, including previously and occasionally still taboo matters such as mental illness, sexuality, and suicide, often set in relation to broader social and familial themes. And this involves the disclosure of personal revelations and secrets through non-fiction forms such as diaries and memoirs. So, okay, for our question number 3, confessional poetry has been described as the poetry of the blank. Okay, is it A, poet, B, symbolism, C, personal, or D, colloquial? So, okay, type your answers in the comment box in 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1. And here we go, we have another question. Okay, so for our question number 4, confessional poetry can be in form of the following except A, autobiography, B, diaries, C, memoirs, or D, epic. So type your answers again in our comment box. Okay, so let's move on to the emotional authenticity of professional poet. So, when we say emotional authenticity, it is about an authentic or genuine emotion that is sincere and spontaneous response to the eliciting situation, which is based on personal experiences and real-life situations, providing negative feelings such as fear, rage, despair, and impotence. The attention and artistic value normally reserved for positive emotions. So another fact is confessional poets wrote in direct, colloquial speech rhythm and used images that reflected intense psychological experience, often culled from childhood or battles with mental illness or breakdown. Okay, can you imagine? Unlike other poets in other genre who uses more figurative language and deep words in their writing, confessional poets uses colloquial speech. And of course, when we say colloquial speech, it is in form of informal manner or a speech used in everyday conversation. Okay, they tend to utilize sequences, emphasizing connections between poems. So, they grounded their work in actual events, referred to real persons, and refused any metaphorical transformation of intimate details into universal symbols. And for our question number 5, our last question. Okay, listen. Confessional poets wrote in blank. Is it A, colloquial speech, B, figurative language, C, metaphorical speech, or D, symbolic language? So, type your answers in the comment box. And before I end my presentation, I would like to give a remarkable statement about confessional poetry. So this is the statement. Where sonnets are often associated with love and epics ultimately celebrate strength, confessional poetry exposes and intimately handles private human pains. So, I want you to reflect on that remarkable statement about the difference of other kinds of writing like sonnet and epic. And that wraps up my discussion for today. And before I end, I would like to get this opportunity to present you my short evaluation that will determine your knowledge or your learning about my discussion. So, since I cannot call you one by one, I would just like to include these questions on my quiz later. Okay, so here is the 2 questions. So, number 1 is, what is the difference of confessional poetry and other kind of writings? Or simply, what made the confessional poetry unique? And number 2, how do you think writing confessional poetry affect the writer's well-being? And with that, I would like to give the floor to Miss Mendoza. Thank you so much for listening, everyone. And I hope that you really learned something from me today.
A pleasant day, learners. I am Mendoza Sheridan M of BSed English 3A1, and for this video, we are going to tackle the continuation of the discussion for the topic Confessional Poetry. But before we begin, let me first present to you our lesson objectives. At the end of the discussion, the students must be able to: first, give the different characteristics of confessional poetry. Next, identify the writing style of a confessional poet. And lastly, appreciate how confessional poetry affects the writer's well-being. Now, we are ready to proceed to our lesson proper. By taking into consideration that confessional poetry began as one of many artistic movements in post-war 20th century America, and its most fundamental aspect is blatant autobiographical content, which often manifests as self-deprecation, as mentioned in the first part of the discussion, the term confessional poetry first appeared in print in September 1959 when critic Macha Louis Rosenthal used it to describe Robert Lowell's life studies in the nation. The collection, which included poems that frankly described Lowell's experiences with marital conflict, generational conflict, and mental illness, signaled a significant turning point in his literary career. With its use of confidences that, in Rosenthal's words, beyond customary bounds of reticence or personal embarrassment, the confessional approach to lyric poetry set itself apart from the other forms. The term has since been applied to the works of several poets, primarily Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, Sylvia Plath, and W.D. Snodgrass. And now, let us dig deeper onto who these authors are and what are their contributions in the confessional poetry. So, one of the influential poets in the contemporary American poetry scene is Robert Lowell. His most significant composition, which is Life Studies, is an example of confessional poetry from the late 1950s to the 1960s. It presented American spiritual civilization and universality under the influence of psychological coercion and discusses the poet's private life. In his poem, Lowell outlined his unique perspective on the connection between the harsh outside world and the suffering self. His characterization-based critique of modern culture was a key element of his confessional poem. Life Studies was written by Lowell as a form of therapy to help him deal with his childhood trauma as well as the social issues that modern Americans were facing at that time. Many authors have argued that they write in order to survive, and numerous writers have committed suicide. Few connections have been as clear-cut as the one with the poet Anne Sexton. She was born in Newton, Massachusetts on November 9, 1928. She attended boarding school at Rogers Hall, Lowell, Massachusetts, where she first started writing poetry. She eventually joined a Boston-based group of mid-century confessional poets, including Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath, where personal pathos, family suffering, and severe depression provided much of the material for their work. In 1957, her therapist encouraged her to write poetry to prevent her suicidal ideation. Despite Sexton's phenomenal professional success in what they mostly started as a passion, she was overcome by her disease and killed herself in 1974. For the third one, we have Sylvia Plath, a poet, novelist, and a short story writer from the United States. Sylvia Plath was born on October 27, 1932 and passed away on February 11, 1963. She is recognized for developing the confessional poetry genre and is most known for her two published collections, The Colossus and Other Poems of 1960 and Ariel of 1965. As well as The Bell Jar, which is a semi-autobiographical book that was released just before her passing in 1963. Sylvia Plath, whose writing is frequently autobiographical and incredibly intimate, is one of the most well-known confessional poets. Her poetry frequently discusses her battle with mental illness, and she is also well known for committing suicide in the end. A notable illustration of Plath's preference for serious subject matter and of confessional poetry in general is the poem Daddy. As the poem's name implies, Daddy can be seen as a reaction to Plath's experiences and connection with her father. When she was 8 years old, Otto Plath passed away, and in Daddy, it seems as though Plath has grown to have something of an Electra complex. And when we say Electra complex, it is a psychoanalytic term used to describe a girl's sense of competition with her mother for the affection of her father. The confessional school of poetry, which later influenced writers like Sylvia Plath, Ted Hughes, and even his instructor Lowell, is seen to have its origin in Snodgrass poetry. American poet William DeWitt Snodgrass, who was born in January 5, 1926 and passed away on January 13, 2009, also wrote under the pen name S.S. Gordons, and he received the Poetry Pulitzer Prize in 1960. In his poems, the poet reflects on important aspects of life in an illuminating way by focusing on intimate, personal experiences. Although this tone has been present throughout his poetry, as can be seen in The Campus on the Hill and A Locked House, he abandoned the formal format of his earlier work in favor of a free verse approach. In each of these four instances, the poets were close friends, and some critics contend that their works shared traits or characteristics. But there has never been a strong confessional poetry movement. Who is and is not confessional poet is still a subject of intense controversy. Some argue that Plath does not fit in this category, and Snodgrass rejected the label outright. Though the designation of confessional poet is rare, the writing of confessional poetry continues today. And that ends our discussion for the topic confessional poetry. And for me to ensure that you have gained knowledge from this presentation, I have prepared here some questions that you will answer, which will also serve as your assignment. First, what is confessional poetry and the writing style of a confessional poet? Next, from the given poets that was mentioned in the discussion, who caught your attention the most and why? And lastly, in your own opinion, how does writing confessional poetry affect the writer's well-being? This will be passed on our meeting next week. Again, this is Mendoza Shardel M, and thank you for listening. See you next meeting!